I appreciate you joining me today. Now, you were on staff at Gateway Church from 2005 until 2014. What was it like for you to hear the allegations against Robert Morris?
You know, I've been trained to think two different things at one time. I'm a human being who has my own particular set of emotions and thoughts and experiences, and I also think kind of what is this going to mean? What's the big picture? What are the other people that'll be affected? What are the implications? And so my mind did both of those things at once. And of course, the personal thing is I'm heartbroken. And first and foremost, of course, the first thing I read was the post that described that she was a 12-year-old girl in pink pajamas. And the very first thing is my heart just broke for a little 12-year-old girl in pink pajamas. Part of my work as a licensed therapist is that I work with people who have been sexually abused at all different stages and ages in life. And when I read that, I think that was even maybe the headline. When I read that, I just thought the implications of that for this poor woman who not only dealt with that at the time, but my goodness, has carried it for a lifetime, likely. And so the first thing, my heart just went out to her. And I think, secondly, I felt a sense of this is not the story that I was told. So almost a sense of betrayal. Well, not almost, yeah, a sense of betrayal and anger about that and sadness. And so my personal response was just an instant empathy for the victim, and then secondarily kind of that anger and response. And then my mind immediately goes to a lot of people are going to see and hear this, and it's a lot of people that I know and love and care about that are going to see and hear this. And so my heart began to break for those people. And then, Billy, it wasn't long before I started hearing from a bunch of those people. They started reaching out, asking questions, or, struggling in some way with what they understood or what they had heard. And so I had both kind of that professional response and personal response almost simultaneously.
Yeah, and I don't want you to share anything you're not comfortable sharing. When you said it was not the story that you were told, I don't know if you can elaborate on that. If you can't, we understand. But it did seem that there was a story that there was information that had been given to church leadership, throughout his time there at the church.
Yeah, I think as near as I understand, and as near as I understand, the public and the church leadership got the same information, or at least at the level of leadership I was. And that information is that there was an inappropriate relationship with a young woman. And in that, I think there's a language there that leads to a certain conclusion. I think that's even part of what I wrote about, is that the language can be designed to use in such a way, to be used in such a way to kind of lead people to natural conclusions, and in many ways fog the actual truth. And so I, along with I think the general public, had heard the same story, which is at some point in his life there was a period of or an experience of immorality or inappropriate relationship with, quote unquote, a young woman. I had no idea that it was a 12-year-old little girl.
Even in the statement that had been released, in the past few days, young lady was the term that was used again. And I know that the victim in this, the accuser in this, took exception to that and said I was 12 years old. I mean, that detail, I think, has been obviously very shocking to people. But to your point, to talk about your post, you posted on X a very long and well thought out message about really just helping people understand the best way to respond to this, the best way to process this. And it included many details, a lot of information. Before we get into that, you served in the church's freedom ministry. What was that work like? What did you do in that role?
Well, more than served in it, I was asked to develop their freedom ministry. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. At that time, I was also a licensed professional counselor. And the request was that I develop a freedom ministry that would be scalable, or that would be something that would help people find freedom at an increasingly broad and deep level. And I arrived, I'll just say it this way, I arrived in a paradigm that was very much deliverance based. When I arrived at Gateway in 2005, their paradigm of, quote unquote, freedom ministry was getting the demons out of people. And while I'm in favor of people not having demons in them, I think there's much more to the story of freedom than simply getting demonic spirits out of their soul. And so my task was two things: to build a structure and strategy that was scalable, but also to change a paradigm about what freedom actually means, is, and how to achieve it. And so at that point, I felt like there was a wide open opportunity and, ironically, freedom to do what they hired me to do and build something that was scalable and potent.
Yeah, and that's helpful to hear that and understand that. When it came to writing this post that you wrote, again, very well thought out, lots of details in that post, responding to all of this. We keep seeing again and again and again abuse allegations, these horrific things happening in churches, in denominations, and you spoke about in this post some of the larger conversations that the church really needs to be having today. And I know that's a broad question, but let's start there. What are some of the conversations that we need to be having as Christians in the church today regarding these issues?
Goodness, we could spend 3 days really parsing out that question, because it's my opinion and observation that there really is an epidemic of abuse within, and in many cases from, the church itself. There's this massive shift taking place. In fact, I would go so far as to say we're well into a significant reformation. And when I say that, I think that there's kind of an upending of the structures that have always held, and some of those structures need to be upended. Specifically, some of the stuff that I wrote about in the post that we'll get to in a few minutes. But the conversations need to, first of all, be one where we consider the idea that if the truth is going to set us free, we first of all have to let it pierce our denial. If the truth is going to set us free, we first of all have to let it shine light on the story we've been telling ourselves instead of the story that's actually happening. I said to you before we started recording today, I've spent about 7.5 years now in the abuse advocacy world. And one of the things that I've realized is that there's once you have experienced psychological, religious, or any other form of sexual abuse, any other form of abuse, you kind of join this unique group of people who sees something that others do not see. And it's not a myth. It's not something that's not real. It's just something that's not evident. And in many cases, one of the things that people don't realize is often even the victim of abuse doesn't realize that what they've been going through is abuse because of the way that it actually unfolds. We have this stereotype picture of abuse of a man in a white tank top beating somebody and leaving bruises, and they wear sunglasses and a scarf. But in reality, most abuse is psychological first and foremost. For all the other forms that become physical, like sexual abuse and violent abuse, those forms also have a foundation of psychological abuse. And at the core of that, at the foundation of all abuse, is what I've termed the misassignment of responsibility. The abuser makes the abuse victim responsible for things that they're actually responsible for. So in the case of sexual abuse, the abuser makes the victim responsible for the abuser's drives. And then they make the victim responsible for the abuser's choice. I did this because you're beautiful. I did this because you're bad. I did this because you're good. And then they make the victim responsible for the secret. If you tell somebody, everything will go wrong. And so what happens is, at first, this misassignment of responsibility doesn't sound as wicked as it actually is. But all this responsibility that belongs to the abuser is placed on the soul of the abuse victim. And they from that point on, believe, whether child or adult, they believe this is my fault. And while it's not, go ahead.
Well, I had to ask you, because as you're explaining this, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but, having spent years now doing this and, coming from a pastoral position, having the experience you do from a Christian lens, how do you hold on to faith? I know this is going to sound like a strange question, when there is so much of this going on. There are people who are asking that question. There are people outside of the church who are looking and saying, this is going on endlessly. This dynamic that you're describing, we're seeing it again and again. We're seeing these headlines. Why should we be attracted to faith? What is true about your faith if this is happening? And how do you, even personally, seeing all of this, hold on to your faith?
Well, I think this may sound a little stereotypical, but I'm going to try to make it not sound that way. True faith is in Jesus himself and who he represents. And I think there's been significant distortions over the generations about what he truly represents. But let's go back and to answer the personal question as well as the way that I communicate it to others is, think about there's a moment where this woman was dragged out into the streets and thrown down at Jesus' feet, and she's quote unquote caught in the act of adultery. And it's always an irony to me that they caught the woman, but there's no man being thrown to the ground. And also interesting to me that who has brought her out there is the religious leaders. So you could look at this and say, this woman was somehow in this, in having a sexual act with somebody. And then the religious leaders drug her out, flung her at the feet of Jesus. And the question that I always pose is, which one did Jesus protect? Did Jesus protect the leaders and their stance, or did Jesus immediately move towards and protect the woman? And so my faith is in the one who sees the oppressed as the reception, the ones who are here to receive what he came to offer, who sees the weak, the wounded, the weary. My faith is in the one who looks to those who need help, not those who believe they are the helpers. There's this moment where Jesus says, I didn't come for the healthy, I came for the sick. And the healthy might stand up and say, look, we are the healthiest ones around. And in doing so, they're literally proclaiming, so we're not in need of what Jesus came to offer. But those who will say, I'm in need, I'm oppressed, I've been wounded, I've been abused, I've been hurt, those are the ones Jesus offered entrance into the kingdom. And so for me, it's the faith that I've maintained is in recognizing the distinction that over the generations, institutions tend to move away from, they kind of calcify and move away from the living, breathing, organic thing that is the gospel. And even if within those institutions, the gospel may have some presentation, the institutions themselves can, like I said, calcify in such a way that they hang on to the moment, even if God is moving into the next moment in a different way. And so I just kind of keep my one ear to the breath of God and one ear to who are the people who are looking to him.
No, that's incredibly important, and I appreciate you explaining that because I understand that. I know a lot of people are asking those questions, and we have to address it, because it's a very big piece of the puzzle here from both the outside world and then inside the church. People who, they may walk away from their faith, they may lose their faith over these sorts of instances, especially when you're seeing them happen again and again. And that brings me to something else that you talk about in your post, and it's this sort of special standing that pastors and faith leaders have sort of been given. And it seems, and this is just sort of me editorializing a little, but it seems to be even more pronounced when you have, megachurch pastors, or you have people, and there's nothing wrong with being an author or being out there doing other things, but when there's a personality, it seems like it's even more elevated that they're in this position where people almost see them in a different light than they do other believers. I don't know if you want to talk about that dynamic at all and how it may play into this, but it seems important to address.
It's incredibly important in this. And I really try to highlight three very specific. There's so many dynamics I don't talk about in the post. And I want to be really clear that the purpose of that post was to say, listen, we ought to deal with whatever happened at Gateway Church and prior to, the years prior. We ought to deal with that in spirit and in truth. But if we don't have the bigger conversation, this will happen again, and this will happen again, and this will happen again. And so even though what spurred that post for me was what's going on at Gateway Church, I've watched this happen, as have you. We've got names like Ravi Zacharias, and there are many people who still don't know what happened there because of the work of that hierarchical institution to hide that from most people's eyes. There's still people, when I talk to them, they say, what happened with Ravi? He's my hero. And yet once you see, you realize that that's part of the issue. You've got these large platforms, whether megachurch or kind of global ministry kind of things, that afford people increasingly unaccountable power. And by power, I don't mean spiritual power. I mean the power to influence organizations and people. That's a meaningful difference. Spiritual power stops storms and evicts demons. Human power just hires and fires people. And that being the case, kind of that increasing level of human power, whatever may be unfinished in the soul of a leader, the higher you propel them on a platform, the more those unfinished things affect everything underneath it. That's part of the nature of a hierarchical organization, is that the top of the organization broadcasts down through the organization its mental, emotional, and relational health levels. And so when you've got, you mentioned the megas, when you've got mega churches or large organizations with a key charismatic leader, whatever's not finished in his or her soul, that is broadcast throughout the structures and processes of that organization. And that being the case, one of the elements of that is giving them that special standard that says, because you're the special leader, even if you mess some things up, we're going to protect you. There's one of the things I really wanted to shine a light on is that once you start to put your feet in that advocacy world, you'll hear a term called DARVO. And DARVO is this kind of weird dynamic that happens, I would say, consistently. I almost want to say almost consistently, but I think consistently happens. And it stands for deny, accuse, and reverse the victim and offender, DARVO, deny. Those allegations aren't true. Accuse, the accuser is the bad guy. Now I'm going to reverse and make the victim the bad guy and the offender the good guy. And that dynamic is, now I'll just say, that's something that's in the world and not just in the church. That's something that you see in any relationship or structure where abuse takes place, and because one of the elements of abuse is always a power differential. The one person who's the abusive person has power over the abuse victim or victims. And that position of power allows them to dictate not only what happens, but also the narrative that takes place around what happens. And so when the narrative is controlled by the abuser and or those who are supporting and defending the abuser, they deny what happened. That's not really what happened. They accuse the victim. Really what happened is they were the one who caused the abuse. They were the ones who, and remember what I said a minute ago, the misassignment of responsibility causes the abuse victim to believe that they're responsible. And this reversing victim and offender, or accusing the victim, is a part of that and plays into that, so that now what happens next is the public believes the abuser's perspective and begins to hone in on the victim as the wrong person and the perpetrator of abuse as the one who should be protected and defended. And you've completed the deny, attack, and reverse the victim with the offender and the offender with the victim. And it's one of the reasons why we in the culture, and ultimately we in the church, haven't been able to solve the issue of abuse, because people don't recognize it when it's right in front of their eyes. They think some poor person is being blamed for something that's not really their fault, when in reality, they've done harm and are getting away with it because people circle the wagons and protect them. And so that special status of the religious leader that says, spiritually and socially, I'm a notch to 10 notches above. And so I should be given special privilege, special protection. I should be given this position of specialness that says, even if I hurt people, I've helped more than I've hurt. So protect me while I continue to hurt and help people.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, because it's one that you often will see in celebrity culture in the world, right? You'll see celebrities who behave in that way as well, where they feel entitled to behave a certain way because they're special or people pay more attention to them. So it's kind of an interesting parallel. But this kind of brings me to another part of what you were talking about in that post, this idea of, in some people's eyes, the pastor, the church sort of being the end all be all of all issues. And when you have a sin issue versus a legal issue, how sometimes these legal issues, I mean, in this case, if these allegations are true, obviously you're dealing with a legal issue here that should have been dealt with, presumably by authorities, right? But that gets sort of swept into the sin issue and it's not really dealt with. Whereas in the world, if somebody did the same thing, they'd be in prison, right? So talk a little bit about that dynamic and why that unfolds, where the legal and the sin sort of get meshed together.
I think we see and hear various scriptures, like Paul talks to the Corinthian church about not going to court against a brother, and we see various times where Paul says, handle your issues between each other. But I think Paul's talking about things like, hey, you stole my cow. Well, that's not your cow, that's my cow. I don't think he's talking about criminal acts. But what happens is we build this category. The other thing where I see people kind of lump this into this dangerous category is all sin is equal in the eyes of God. We could talk for an hour about what we need to understand about that concept, but functionally, the difference in God's eyes is, did it come from God or did it come from you? And in that sense, what came from God will return to God. What came from you is only temporary and therefore doesn't live forever. And so whether you stole a pack of gum or you're Adolf Hitler and you murdered 6 million people, neither one of those things are spiritual, or not, neither one of those things are eternal. And in that sense, they're the same in God's eyes. But the condition of a man's heart that leads to stealing a pack of gum, and the condition of a man's heart that leads to murdering 6 million people, or 11 million, however you want to count that, the condition of the heart is far different in those two events. And not only condition of the heart, but the both immediate and generational impact is very different. So you've got people who say all sin is the same in God's eyes. And what's happening is what's called sin leveling. We're kind of bringing this thing down to, well, all people are sinners. So why are you judging this person? Because you're a sinner too. And the difficulty is, especially when we're talking about predators, I think I think it's important that we understand the third point that I'm sure we'll get to, is that I think often in the church we oversimplify the issue and make it just about misbehavior, and we don't understand that there's some pretty serious and complex issues. Predatory behavior looks for victims on purpose, and predatory behavior is looking not just to have sex but to have dominance. And so predatory behavior isn't just about someone who's sexually abusing somebody. There's a whole set of dynamics behind that. And so the idea that you would have someone whose mindset is predatory and say, well, we're all sinners, so you're a sinner too, not only forgive them but put them back in the pulpit, kind of that whole language where we take the specificity out of circumstances and behavior and events by saying things like a moral failure, or an inappropriate relationship. These are all such foggy and non-specific terms, and I think that's at the core of this situation as well. If I've heard and understood right, the language used to present what happened and what was supposedly dealt with was
Like
not.
young lady versus 12-year-old girl, right? I mean, if these details are all true, those are a young lady and a 12-year-old girl in the context of this situation are very different things.
Very different things. And then inappropriate relationship. The concept of relationship would suggest mutuality between two people, where both of them brought something to the situation. But an inappropriate relationship is not the same thing as abuse. Abuse is committed by one person against another person. And so using kind of those general terms about sin and falling, and we all make mistakes. When we're talking about someone, and again, I'm not trying to say this is specifically true about Robert Morris. I'm simply saying that in the larger picture, we look at people who've shown a pathway of predatory behavior and thought process, and we hear people say, well, we're all sinners, we should just forgive them and put them back in a place of ministry. Well, you wouldn't put a tiger in a place of ministry to a hen house. It's just not a fit. He didn't just fall; he was acting out his nature, and so you put someone who has predatory proclivity in a situation where they've got a power differential over a lot of people. That's kind of like putting an alcoholic in a bar and suggesting that they don't touch any alcohol. They might be able not to, but they're churning on the inside. And so the whole idea that we use language that's non-specific, and we deal with sin as if, well, it's the church's territory to deal with sin. But what if some of that sin really is legal sin? What if it is a crime? And the church looks at that and says, and uses this term. They had an inappropriate relationship. They were having an issue of lust. We will do what we do to, there's a lot of talk about rehabilitation or, whatever it takes to put somebody back into a place of ministry. And there's a naivety about what we're actually dealing with. You don't put a tiger back in charge of a hen house, and you don't put somebody with a proclivity towards predatory behavior in a position of authority over people, whether a staff or a congregation. And so you take those two things together, right? We oversimplify kind of this issue of sin and use language about it that minimizes it and generalizes it. And you take special people or people who've been told that they're special and put in positions that are called special. And what you have is if it doesn't create selfish behavior, it attracts people with that tendency. I read a while back, and I haven't seen it. I'm sorry, I should have looked at it before this, but I read a list I think it was from the FBI, the 10 positions, the 10 professions that most attract narcissists. And, of course, the list is things like CEOs and policemen and people who have positions of power over others. And right about midway through that list is pastor. Again, don't hear that all pastors are narcissists, but what I'm saying is there's something about that position that's very attractive to somebody who thrives on flexing the muscle of power over others. And so all that to say, and especially when we have this tendency to tell them they're special spiritually, because there's the power differential. I'm God's chosen man. You are under me. And take the abuse thing out of that for a second, Billy. That's just harmful to people's spiritual development.
Yeah.
At the foot of the cross, none of us are better than the other.
Can I ask you that? I mean, you spent a lot of time, at the church. Was there ever any indication in your view just of power differentials being off, of anything like that translated into the church dynamic itself?
Let me answer that in a more general way than that. It's one of the things that people really misunderstand in the issue of clergy abuse in general is the concept of a power differential isn't simply somebody who flexes their muscle. It exists because of position. Even in the counseling setting, when a client walks into my office here, there's an expectation that I'm quote unquote the expert and they're the one to receive expert input. And so there exists in my profession a power differential, regardless of my personality. My position puts me in a position where people look to me as someone more powerful than them. Because we see the same thing in this profession. We see people that abuse their clients. We see people that financially exploit them. We see people that sexually exploit their clients. And the power differential is, now I know what your question was, and I know I'm not answering it, but
No, that's okay. This is important.
Yeah, the power differential is something that exists simply because of position. And it's one of the reasons why people say that pastor had an affair with somebody in his congregation. And from the advocacy world comes this echo that says, no, he abused her. And people say, no, but the woman was a willing participant. And the ongoing legal discussion, and many states are making the change, is that you can't give consent when there's a power differential. People don't recognize the psychological influence of this person has power over me. If you've ever had a boss that was even just harsh, much less abusive, if you've had a boss that, used manipulation over you, you recognize they hold some control over you. And so you may look like you're just being cooperative, and your boss may tell his boss, hey, Billy's one of the most helpful people on my staff. He's always volunteering to help. But somewhere in your soul that you're doing it to preserve your safety. And so people think that there's mutuality in these relationships when there's a pastor and a congregant. But the reality is that is a power differential simply because of position. And even more of a power differential because they're a quote unquote spiritual leader. There's that special status. Think about what was I wish I could remember the quote, when you help the shepherd, you help the sheep. and it was used to abuse. It was one of the early exposures of a known leader. And the phrase that was kind of passed around those days was, he'd said to this woman whom he was seducing, when you help the shepherd, you help the sheep. And it was this manipulation of spiritual position. I won't say spiritual authority, because that's not spiritual authority. But it was this manipulation of position that says, because I'm quote unquote a man of God, what you do for me helps everybody
Mm.
else.
And that can be
Incredibly,
dangerous. I mean, that could be incredibly dangerous, that mindset.
incredibly dangerous.
So we have to go in a couple minutes here. You've been amazing with your time. I think the big question a lot of people have, one of them coming out of this conversation, out of the allegations, this circumstance, is, how can churches and Christians stem the abusive tides before they wash away churches and congregations, before it gets to this point?
Yeah. It's, there's two conversations that have to happen simultaneously. There's a heartbreaking event that is unfolding at Gateway Church right now as we speak. I'm still getting messages from people. I've got friends I've got counselors that are texting me talking about they're being flooded with people that are being, just overwhelmed by what's going on. There's a heartbreaking event going on right now, and that has to be addressed. When I said in my post, we missed the opportunity to protect the church, I'm not talking about an institutional church. I'm talking about, we have to protect the people who show up vulnerable and asking for spiritual connection. We have to make a way to protect in the midst of what's going on there. But the bigger conversation, the one I really tried to stir and bring some attention to in my post, and like I said, there's so many more things, it was just getting long. But the bigger conversation is that within the church, we should be the ones who can figure out how not to do this. And what I mean by not to do this is, it's not just about this person abuse this person. But when I teach about the dynamic of abuse, there's always a quote unquote third party, whether it's a counselor, a pastor, or even a whole congregation. That third party looks onto the situation and does this thing where they reverse the victim and the offender. And when they do that, the person who's been a victim is victimized twice. First, they're victimized by the abuser. And then the most heartbreaking thing, Billy, when I deal with people who've trying to get out of abusive relationships in a church context, often find that they not only lose their family, but they also lose their church family, because they are pointed as the bad guy. And then again, the abuser is platformed and protected and glorified and given, look how he's stood for, or she's stood for this all this time. And the number one thing that I think we need to do is, we need to have our eyes open to this idea that what we're told, and I'm not even talking about intentional deception, I'm talking about the portrayal of abuse in public eye, often is that this person here who's wondering why his spouse won't submit might actually be an abusive person, and she's simply trying to catch a breath. She's simply trying to feel safe. She's simply trying to get to a place where on a day-to-day basis, she can be safe and her kids can be safe. When we can stop protecting the abusive ones and begin to protect, defend, and comfort and care for the victims. Again, go back to what I said, woman caught in adultery, thrown at the feet of Jesus. And Jesus looks at the religious leaders who are trying to get him to give permission to stone her. And he looks at the woman and he moves toward her and sends them away.
Yes.
The biggest thing and first thing is to begin to see the picture as it is, not as it's been portrayed to us.
I so appreciate you taking the time. This is complicated. I know it's very personal for you as well, in light of the fact that you spend so much time, working at the church there at Gateway. And I just appreciate you taking us through these different pieces of the puzzle today. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.